This video is how has gender affected your experiences of mental health? So in my area there's a women's crisis house, which is like a direct alternative to hospital admission for women who are in a mental health crisis. And every time they have an assessment, they ask whether the woman they're assessing has ever been abused, either sexually, physically or emotionally. And the overwhelming majority of women say yes. And I think that actually pretty much all women have experienced some kind of sexual or gendered violence, even if we don't always identify it as abuse, because it's on a spectrum. Like street harassment is related to sexual abuse because it's all about power. And the first 7 or 8 times that I was asked that question, like my first 7 or 8 assessments there, I said no, but I changed my answer the last time I stayed there. I'd kind of always thought that my experiences of sexual violence were within the range of normal, and that they were kind of somehow acceptable because of that, because they were just, oh well, everyone's had that. But then I was writing a blog about gender and mental health, and I wrote down something that I remembered happening to me when I was very young, and it suddenly dawned on me that if it had happened to anybody else, I would call it abuse. But actually, even if what I'd experienced, just the everyday sexisms that pretty much all women go through, even if they were within the range of normal, then I think they would still be enough to mean that when I'm in crisis and I'm frightened, I'm more frightened of men, especially men who I don't know. But the default for mental health services is that they're mixed gender in terms of both the staff and the service users. And you have to push quite hard to be admitted to a single gender ward or service, and the tendency is to wait until something goes wrong and then fix it, like admit a woman to a mixed gender ward, and then if she's clearly frightened of the men, move her to a single gender one. Whereas actually it would be possible to get it right first time if services were commissioned on the assumption that women who are frightened are more frightened of men. And so during my last crisis, I consented to go into hospital if I could be admitted to a single gender ward, but there were no beds for 4 days, and I ended up being sectioned by the police because I wouldn't consent to go to a mixed ward. But then that meant I was at home for 4 days when I was really unsafe, and I ended up trying to jump off a bridge. So yeah, the resources just aren't there. Services aren't commissioned to meet people's gender-related needs. And actually in my area, there are a lot more resources than there are in most. So I wrote a piece last year about the different experiences of staying at a women's service that's run by women and being on mixed gender wards. And I'm going to read that out because sometimes these things are quite difficult to think about. So it's easier if I can read from something I've written than just talking. I don't like strange men watching me sleep. Most women wouldn't, but women in mental health crisis often have to deal with it during the most frightening periods of our lives. Last September, I was in hospital after a suicide attempt, and I was put on one-to-one observation as I was deemed a high risk to myself. This meant that someone was allocated to monitor me at all times. On day 2 of my admission, that person was a man. I hated knowing that if I took too long in the bathroom, which I wasn't allowed to lock, a man I didn't know might come in. I panicked. I unhooked my drip and tried to run away. The doctors did not think this was a good idea. I was sectioned. In April, I was put on one-to-one observation on a mental health ward with a male member of staff. On those wards, the doors are locked. I couldn't bolt, so I curled up in a ball and screamed. Maybe this makes me seem mad, but at the time it felt like the only possible response to being trapped on a corridor of strangers at night where a man I didn't know was going to watch me sleep. These experiences are a world apart from my stays at Drayton Park Women's Crisis House, a residential alternative to hospital for women in mental health crisis. There, nobody is ever locked in and only women work there. The staff still check on residents regularly, but I knew that the person knocking on my bedroom door at midnight would always be a woman, so I wasn't humiliated or frightened. And the checks were accompanied by intensive therapeutic work, usually 2 individual sessions a day, so I felt contained rather than controlled. In mixed gender residential services, I hardly left my room because I got unwanted attention from the male patients. But the more time I spent alone, the further my thoughts could run away with me. At Drayton Park, I had spaces to sit with other women without fear of harassment. It also helped that it's a normal house. The bedding isn't mint green hospital blankets and the floors are carpeted. These things make a difference. Cold, clinical environments where all the cutlery is plastic and every surface is wiped clean don't lift anyone's mood. As a women's service, Drayton Park have also had to develop robust policies around self-harm, as it affects significantly more women than men. They spoke to me openly about it from the start, accepted that I might not be able to stop completely, and worked with me to manage the risk. On the wards, the staff searched my room and I always found ways to hurt myself. At Drayton Park, I learned to trust them enough to hand in anything I wasn't safe to have. It was the first residential service where I didn't feel judged or punished for wanting to self-harm. This gave me the freedom to say when I was struggling, and so gradually I learned other ways to cope. There's plenty of discussion in mental health around safety, but very little about what makes people feel safe. I think the best way to keep people physically safe, and the only way to make that safety sustainable once we go home, is to develop a relationship with staff where we feel safe emotionally. It's no coincidence that the only crisis service where I have felt that is run by women for women.